Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin Duffy, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the afternoon. Mr. Jeff Hunt specializes in crisis management and preparedness branding, CEO communications, reputation management, and social media strategy. He is a founder and partner at Legend Labs, a brand and innovation consulting firm that helps organizations and individuals create, live, and protect their legends. During the course of his 25-year career, he has worked with DuPont, IBM, AT&T, Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, Dell, Nike, Whole Foods, and many other companies. Mr. Hunt has lived throughout the world and navigated many cultures on behalf of their clients. Prior to establishing Legend Labs, Mr. Hunt was president of Cohn & Wolfe, a global public relations firm formed following a merger with GCI Group. He has also served as CEO of GCI and Reed Poland Associates. He spent 18 years at Burson Marsteller, ultimately serving as Chief Operating Officer for Europe, with responsibility for 16 offices throughout the continent. He has also established the firm's presence in Korea and Mexico. In addition, Mr. Hunt has spent 4 years working on the Fukushima nuclear disaster. A graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, Mr. Hunt serves as adjunct professor at the university's Moody College of Communications and is a frequent lecturer at the McCombs School of Business. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Hunt.
Thank you. Thank you, Midshipman Duffy. I really appreciate that. You know, one of the best things about speaking up here is I get to take my mask off. So I'm sure you guys would, I'm sure you wish you could too. I can't tell you what an honor and a privilege it is to be here. Such a historical institution. And I just take a lot of pride, and I want to thank my colleague Andrew Barlow for giving me the opportunity by introducing me to you. I also want to say that it's not lost on me that I'm in the company of some really great leaders today and some future leaders of tomorrow. And I just want to thank you all, one and all, for your service to our country, those of you that have already served or are serving, and obviously those that are going to go on and do great things going forward. So thank you for letting me be here. I got to edit my bio because you know how sometimes people use a photograph that looks like their high school yearbook picture? I didn't do that, but I actually have 35 years now, and that's why my hair is so great. And over the course of 35 years, I've lived and worked all over the world and largely done a lot of work in crisis and issues management. And for the longest time, we thought that the best way to manage a crisis or to get help with a crisis was usually to get somebody that had a lot of direct experience, so the gray hair, meaning that there wasn't a lot that you could actually teach because every crisis is so unique. So what you did is you went out and you hired the guru, and the guru hopefully had some experiences that was somewhat relevant, and then they could kind of help guide you through it. And I would say that that largely held true. But about, I'd say 15 years ago, I really marked a stark change, a pivot, if you will, that coincided with the advent of digital and social media. And one of the big things that I was involved with early on, and most of you in the room would be too young, or even on the Zoomcast would be too young to remember this, but early on, before there was Twitter, before there was Facebook, the blogosphere was really kind of blowing up. And a company called Dell got the brunt of the blogosphere. And they went through something that was called Dell Hell. And effectively, their consumer business expanded rapidly, and they sort of lost the ability to properly serve their customers, and then they tried to outsource service to India, and it just all went bad on them, okay? And I marked that, and then later they had a huge recall because their laptops were catching on fire. And so they had a huge battery recall, and I marked that as the beginning of the change, a fundamental change in the way crises need to be thought about and managed. And while I didn't think the world needed another business book, I did think that there was enough changes that could be codified, particularly for CEOs and other C-suite executives, that it was worth doing it. So that's what the book is all about. And I've got about 15 or 20 copies of the book. I'm not trying to sell a book, so if anybody wants a book and I don't have enough here, just shoot me a note and I'll send you a book. But what I'm going to go through today is sort of a high-level synopsis of some of the key takeaways. Now, while this is largely directed at companies and organizations, I actually do a lot of work with individuals too. particularly athletes. So I've worked with Serena Williams and Venus Williams and Dustin Johnson and Brooks Koepka. So I think the lessons that I'll be imparting on you, you can also take to heart as you manage your own individual brand, your individual legend, if you will, but also as you move into your organizations, you can think about it there. So I thought what I would do, just to kind of get us in the spirit, is do a quick little playback. So each year for the last 4 years, people on my team have kind of taken a look back at the news in the previous year and put together what you might call a highlight reel. Although I would tell you this is not a highlight reel you want to be in. So let me just kind of get you in the mood for crisis discussion by playing you this quick little video.
A mob of President Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol in an attempt to stop the certification of the election result.
GameStop's stock is surging. After months and months of being a cheap name on the market, the video game retailer has soared about 800% in the last week.
Texas residents there, they've been dealing with the brutal cold and the catastrophic failure of their state's energy infrastructure, living without power.
The prince said they left Britain and their roles over a lack of support and understanding.
I just didn't want to be alive anymore.
One ship at the center of a major marine traffic jam.
Global computer chip shortage is impacting industries from medical devices to military equipment.
College basketball's March Madness is currently filled with anger over gender inequality.
This is our weight room. Let me show y'all the men's weight room.
For so many, Peloton has been the secret to coping with pandemic lockdowns. Now the company is announcing a voluntary recall of its Tread and Tread Plus treadmills. The Consumer Product Safety Commission says one child has died and there have been more than 70 incidents, including a brain injury.
The federal government today confirmed that a Russian criminal group is behind the hacking of a crucial energy pipeline.
And Facebook's oversight board has decided to uphold the site's suspension of former President Donald Trump.
Florida is the latest state to ban transgender women from competing in women's sports.
At least 26 states have now introduced similar bills.
A new CDC forecast says COVID hospitalizations could quadruple by Labor Day to more than 33,000 admissions a day.
New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo revealing he will resign amid this sexual harassment scandal.
Tonight, 4 of the greatest athletes in the history of American gymnastics demanding justice.
Thought given the severity of this situation, they would act quickly for the sake of protecting other girls.
Authorities launching a criminal investigation to find out what went wrong at the Astro World Music Festival.
The Biden administration will not send any diplomatic or official representation to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics.
Tonight, the Omicron variant on the move, with cases detected in roughly 40 countries and at least 13 states in the U.S.
We're going to get her in.
USA! USA!
So each year we capture that, and I think, man, that was a really tough year, right? And in fact, it seemed tougher than the year before. And I guess I would ask you, not figuratively, but not literally, but figuratively, was it just a really abnormally tough year? Or is it the fact that we're getting tuned into these crises much more frequently and much more sort of in a close-up way because of digital and social media? And in fact, if you think about the last 4 or 5 major crises that you've kind of witnessed, odds are somebody with an iPhone probably broke it for you first. So we're going to talk a bit about that and some of the trends. You know, for 35 years, I've been preaching, and we've all been preaching in our industry about the importance of crisis preparedness, issues management. And this is something you guys probably are better at than anybody, anticipating the unexpected and getting yourselves ready for it. Because as this quote says, by the time you hear the thunder, it's too late to build the ark. And that's always been true. But by the way, today in this digital and social age that we live in, it's even more true. By the way, one of the things that I want to mention to you, people talk about Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. I get less caught up in the platform of the technology than I do in a common understanding about what these social technologies do. And in a nutshell, what they do is they scale intimacy. They scale intimacy. And they're obviously very fast at doing that. And so things get put on steroids very quickly, and that's what's really made a big difference in crisis and issues management. By the way, beloved brands are just as susceptible. So just as an example, the Naval Academy would be considered a very beloved brand, just as this one is, which is one of my favorites, Bluebell Ice Cream. And these brands are held to even a higher standard, because in the first place, people don't expect you to ever have that crisis because they think you're above that. But when you do have the crisis, the expectations of how you're going to handle it are even higher than sort of your everyday average brand. So just something to keep in mind. And by the way, I would say the same thing for you as individual naval officers eventually, is that because of the reputation that you have as a group, any individual sort of carries a bigger load than otherwise might be the case. So what are some of the things that have created this, this sort of new environment, this new operating environment that we're in? And the first is what I call the emergence of the nanosecond news cycle. Nanosecond news cycle. So it used to be that these news things kind of happened in 24-hour cycles. So to give you an example, in the old days, we would have a crisis, we would sort of make our first piece of communications to sort of communicate our position. We'd see how it went in the 12 o'clock news slot. We'd see the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news. By the way, back in the day, there was a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper. And we'd go all the way to 10 o'clock and we'd say, okay, 10 o'clock news, how did it work? And then we would do an overnight poll, right? We would send a poll out. And the next morning, we would come back into our offices and we would have the results for how we did over the course of the last 24 hours. Well, now all this happens like now, real time, nanoseconds, okay? Not hours. Second, something I mentioned previously, the advent of what I call the citizen journalist, meaning everybody with an iPhone is potentially the journalist that's going to break the story, that's going to blow this thing up. Third, this is not a new phenomenon. I think CNN probably started it, but it's this whole idea of local stories going national and international very quickly. Another thing that I'm sure you're all very aware with is that in this world that we're living in, speed is favored over accuracy. Speed is favored over accuracy. So in the old days, again, we had this process that a story had to go through. I called it the sausage factory. But you'd get your first, you'd interview, you'd get the first draft written, and then it would go through a series of edits, right? And by the time it made its way to the 5 o'clock news, you could be reasonably assured that the story was accurate, right? Well, today, after the very first interview is done, the likelihood is that the journalist is going to go right on Twitter and post whatever they got from the first interview, even though they haven't finished kind of creating the full arc of the story, okay? And if they get it wrong, they don't really care that much because they can just go back and correct it. And by the way, why do they want to move so quickly? Because they know there's probably some John Q. public that's going to break the story if they don't break it. So these are some of the dynamics and the pressures that are under. Oops, sorry. Lastly, a vocal minority can be very disruptive. Now, if you're on the receiving end of that, that can be painful. If you're thinking about it in democracy terms, it speaks to the kind of the ability to really move masses quickly with a relatively small force. Now, from day one that I was managing crises, we've always known that when a crisis occurs, a natural vacuum gets opened, okay? And you probably know this from your science classes, but nature abhors a vacuum. So what happens when the vacuum gets opened is we have to make a conscious decision as to whether we're going to fill the vacuum with our information or we're going to let it be filled for us with speculation, innuendo. So as an example, if my factory blows up, right? If I don't tell you as much as I can tell you about what's going to happen, you're going to have a lot of people out there who are willing to tell you what they think happened. And so if you don't take anything else from this presentation today, what I'm going to hope you take away is that I'm a big advocate for communicating, okay? Communicating early and communicating often. And again, even in individual crisis situations. That doesn't mean that every time something happens, we open up the kimono and say, let us tell you everything that happened. No, but our bias is to want to fill the vacuum before it gets filled for us. So I'd like for you to think about this in the context of a personal crisis that you may have gone through, okay? Or a bigger crisis in an organization or a corporation that you've been part of. But I have sort of categorized that over the years of looking at these crises, there are roughly 6 distinct stages that these crises seem to go through. And why is it important to even think about stages of a crisis? So one of the earlier speakers talked about mindfulness. The more mindful you can be about kind of where you are in the crisis, the better you'll be able to sort of manage your way to what I call the other side of the arc. Meaning if I can clearly think about, okay, life is really bad right now. I hate this crisis that I'm in. If I just get muddled in that and I don't see anything into the future, that's a bad road to be on. But if I can say, you know, if I do everything right, I could get over there, right? So the first stage of a crisis is surprise, okay? Invariably, it happens on a Friday evening. You never expected it to happen, so you're surprised. Each one of these stages, by the way, creates an excuse or a reason not to communicate. So you're surprised, you're kind of on your heels. Naturally, you're not going to say, let me come forward and start communicating, right? Second stage, insufficient information. Invariably, we want more facts, we want more details. So before I say anything, I need to know a lot, right? And again, bad instinct, because while you're saying nothing, collecting information, that vacuum that I spoke about is being filled by others, speculation, innuendo. Third is intense scrutiny from the outside. And by the way, this is usually when individuals or organizations know that they're in a crisis. And so what was once a contained little situation that you thought you were dealing with by yourself suddenly gets drilled into by maybe an outsider. Maybe it's the media gives you a call and says, hey, I understand you have a problem. Maybe it's your mother, your father. But suddenly you're no longer able to just kind of manage this in isolation. Everybody's looking in on your crisis. And again, in that kind of environment, do you really want to be communicating? Or do you want to be like kind of hunkering, right? Next is an escalating flow of events. So I don't know if you've ever noticed, but crises never seem to come in 1s and 2s. They always seem to be 3s and 4s. And in the professional world that I live in, oftentimes as we dig deeper to kind of understand the narrative and we start peeling back layers of the onion, suddenly we get these revelations of, oh yeah, we did that too. Oh yeah, and he had 5 previous DWIs and we never fired him. Okay, so the more we dig, the more the events escalate. So escalating flow of events. And again, if you don't know what's coming next, do you really want to be communicating in a forward fashion? Odds are no. That logically leads you into a siege mentality. This idea that the whole world is out to get me and out to get us. And so again, it has you kind of reeling backward, not going forward. And then lastly, the mode that we never need to go into or want to go into, but all too many organizations and individuals do, is what I call the bunker down mode. And that's where you think, okay, I'm just going to put my head in the sand and God help us, this too shall pass. And of course it never does. So I believe that in this new environment that we're operating in, there are sort of 5 key principles that need to be applied. And I know we're always got 5 of this and 4 of that, but there are 5 here too. And by the way, go back to what really created digital and social media in the first place. What was sort of the impetus for it? And what was the impetus was frankly a fundamental mistrust of institutions. So whether it's media institutions, government institutions, educational institutions, we've always trusted peer-to-peer, right, communications. And so as I go back to what I said earlier, these digital and social media technologies scale intimacy and give you the ability to have one-on-one conversations with people that you know and trust. Now, it's also a very authentic environment, okay? So it means that people don't like institutional language in these social channels. They don't like corporate speak in these channels. So let's say my good buddy Andrew Barlow and I called him up and say, hey, let's go to the pub and have a beer. And he shows up at the bar and I come up and I open up my laptop and start doing a PowerPoint presentation, right? Wrong place, wrong time. And that's similar to this. So these first two principles are cultural. So what I always say to organizations is if I'm coming into the war room and we're arm wrestling with the legal team over if we will disclose, we're toast. Because the nanosecond news cycle has already left us behind. So we have to have a common cultural agreement about how we're going to comport ourselves in a crisis well before a crisis occurs. So authenticity is critical. People want an authentic understanding of what happened. And that means they want it from the person who is the most qualified expert. So it's not always the CEO, by the way. It's the person who can give me the most information, the best information. Second is transparency. In this interconnected world that we live in, you have to assume that everything is discoverable in time, right? Everything is discoverable in time. So go back to that vacuum, you have to ask yourself, who do I want to write the narrative? Do I want to write it and disclose it on my terms, or do I want to have it discovered and disclosed for me? So transparency is critical. Third is speed, because I mentioned the nanosecond news cycle. If we're sitting around trying to figure things out for too long, again, the narratives run away from us, and we're spending time trying to kind of catch up. So speed is critical. Fourth is agility. So I mentioned that old 24-hour news cycle. Well, now we have these very sophisticated listening software that allows us to really understand the conversation around our crisis in real time, so that before we deploy the first message, right, again, I'm talking more about a corporate environment, we can understand how people are talking about our crisis. What are the common concerns that they have? Who's carrying the most influence? Who are the agitators? And when we deploy our first message, we have the ability to deploy it with empathy, okay? So let's take a case where we say, okay, this crisis is bad, but we don't think it's risen to the level where we want to expose the CEO, okay? We're going to hold her back because we don't think it's risen to that level. Instead, we're going to use the VP of Operations. So we put the VP of Operations out there. He speaks, okay, tries to deliver our message. And within minutes, we're using this social listening to say, how's it working? And suddenly we're getting killed. Where's the CEO? Doesn't she care? Again, if we're agile, we're listening, we can course correct in a moment's notice to say, hey, we screwed up. We got to get her out there. And that's what I mean by agility in a crisis. The last one is creativity. Creativity. And when I say creativity in a crisis, people often look at me like, you're crazy. Creativity? The best way I can explain this to you is when you're communicating in a crisis, but frankly, anytime, content always wins. Content always wins. And whoever has the most creative content generally wins. So let me get, anybody here from the West Coast? Okay. I don't know if you'll remember this. You may be too young. I hate to keep saying that, but we worked on something called the Aliso Canyon gas leak. You may remember it. SoCal Gas stores a massive amount of gas in the Aliso Canyon, and they had a leak. And, you know, gas, by the way, smells funny because they make it smell funny. Normally, you can't smell gas. At any rate, long story short, they had to displace 5,000 people from their homes because it was causing people to get sick and ill. So we show up to sort of help them, you know, convey their position on the matter. And we look into all their channels, their digital, social, their website, and what do we see? We see dense legal language trying to avoid liability. Now then, we go to the Environmental Defense Fund, the adversary in the case, and they're giving us an infrared video of the gas leak. CBS News is giving me an overhead shot of the canyon, right? The company is giving me dense legal language. So where am I going to go? So we need to be really cognizant of the fact that we're in a communication situation where creative content is going to win the day. And so we have to be thinking about that as we're deploying our first, you know, communications in the crisis. Another thing that I like to bring is levity, you know, to the boardroom. So when I come into the boardroom, and by the way, this is something you can apply in your everyday life, okay, individually, as you're looking about your own brand or your own legend. But if you think about it, every crisis has a villain, a victim, a hero, and a moral. All right? So I know some of you are cybersecurity students and experts, or on your way to being experts. If we talk about a major cybersecurity breach at a company, and hopefully you'll yell this out to me, but if I think about that, who's the villain in a cybersecurity breach? Who's the villain? The hacker, right? What happens if the company waits 4 months to tell you about the hack? Who's the villain? The company. So sometimes just being able to kind of, for me personally as a consultant, but for you individually as you're managing your own brand, to have this mindfulness around, look, somebody's going to be cast as the villain here. Somebody's going to be the victim, and somebody's going to be the hero, and somebody's going to be the moral. So it's just a way to think about the crisis. And why is this so, by the way? It's so because from the time we were little kids sitting on our parents' laps, we were told stories, right? And didn't the stories always have this as sort of the basic framework? Villain, victim, hero, moral. So consciously or subconsciously today, as you take in information, you're sorting it. I guarantee you're sorting it this way, whether you know it or you don't know it. Now, anybody here from Texas or West Texas? Okay. You may or may not be familiar or remember, but this was a guy named Red Adair. Now, I'm starting to kind of get into some techniques that we use, by the way. But Red Adair was a very famous oil well firefighter. And so you'd have these wells out in the west part of Texas. They would explode. There'd be these raging fires. And all the CEO had to do was walk up to the podium and say, "We've hired Red Adair." And the crisis was over, right? Now, the crisis wasn't really over. The fires were still flaming. But the mere act of hiring Red Adair creates this sort of calming effect. And so sometimes when we're in a crisis situation, we're looking for our Red Adair or our Red Adair moment. So for example, if you're an individual student, I've gone to the counselor. We worked on the Penn State crisis. I don't know if you guys remember Jerry Sandusky and the Penn State crisis. The Red Adair moment was Louis Freeh. Louis Freeh is hired, former FBI head. Louis Freeh is hired, brought in, say, go wherever the facts take you, and then we use that release. Now, the flip side is when you hire Red Adair, but that you're not authentic and transparent. Any of you, I don't know if there's anybody from Baylor University here, but Baylor, I think, had that experience where they hired the independent investigator, but then they didn't disclose the findings. So what does that say to everybody that's looking from the outside? They must be hiding something, right? So Red Adair. So I mentioned this before, but when I come into a crisis room, a boardroom, one of the best things that I can do is get the leadership team thinking about, again, what I call the other side of the arc. So it's a mess right now, okay? We're not gonna, simplify this or shortcut it. It's a mess. But we have to have the ability to be able to say, it could get better if we do the right things, right? And I call this vision casting. And again, even as an individual, this is something that you can do. It's hard because when you're right in the middle of the mess, it's pretty hard to sort of take a step back and say, let me be mindful about what this could look like, on the other side of the arc. But this is kind of how we do it. So going back to the Penn State crisis, we actually wrote this story. We mocked it up. So this is a fake story. This is fake news, okay? But we mocked it up, and we are back. And what it did is it sort of anticipated Penn State playing for the Big Ten championship 4 years removed from the original sanctions, or 5 years removed. And of course, they got relief a year earlier, all right? And when you read the story, what it does is it talks about all the things that Penn State did to redeem itself, to restore trust and confidence. And what it does is it kind of becomes like the roadmap for the path forward. So I show this to the president, I show this to the provost, the athletic director, the new head coach, Bill O'Brien at the time, and everybody loves it. Okay, well, if you love this, then here's what we're going to have to do. And so it sort of makes the journey, a little bit more manageable going forward. But we call this vision casting, and it's a technique you can use in your own life as well. So how are we doing on time? Pretty good? We got until 2:20? I do want to open it up for some questions. I've got a couple little quick cases that I just wrote, one or two maybe that I'll share quickly just to kind of illustrate the point, but then I do want to open it up for questions. So if you're interested in asking questions, I guess this might be a good time to start formulating them and ultimately coming to the mic if you're interested. So I don't know how many of you remember the United situation where they needed to remove the passenger from the plane. It was a very unruly passenger, and it really became a big mess. And it created a lot of problems for Oscar Munoz, who was the new CEO, relatively new CEO at the time. And I'm going to play this clip for you. And this works better when we have a little bit more intimate audience and I can have a little bit more engagement. But I'm going to play this clip for you, and I just want you to kind of think about your observations of how he does in this situation. Oops. You have any idea why the video's not playing? Huh, it worked before. Huh? Yeah. Okay. Well, you're not going to see that video. Are you coming to try it? Thank you. IT on the spot. See, I had a little crisis here. And
Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg today finally speaking out.
That's the wrong one. That's okay. We'll skip that case. So, at any rate, if you watched it, I'll tell you what the headline of the case was, is that if you hear his statement, you'll say, that was brilliant. That was a really good message. I like the way he said that. And then I will say, well, okay, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem was he said it 48 hours after the fact. It's what he said in the first 2 hours, in the first 6 hours, that really got them into all their problems. Now, to his credit or to his defense, he was trying to be, on the side of his flight attendants, which is understandable, but he forgot the customer. So again, if I showed you it, you'd say, wow, yeah, that was beautiful, but in fact, it was 48 hours too late. Let's watch this one. I don't think this needs any explanation. We've all watched Facebook.
Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg today finally speaking out, admitting mistakes and vowing to correct them. In a statement saying, we have a responsibility to protect your data, and if we can't, then we don't deserve to serve you.
I want to start with just a basic question. Mark, what happened? What went wrong?
So this was a major, and I'm really sorry this happened. We have a basic responsibility to protect people's data. And if we can't do that, then we don't deserve to have the opportunity to serve people.
Zuck is finally speaking out about Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal. It only took him about 5 days, give or take, plus the 2 to 3 years Facebook knew about it and we didn't, but who's counting?
So again, I mean, look, I know he's got some challenges as a communicator, but did that convey, authenticity to you? Did it convey like transparency? And so maybe he's not the best guy to be doing, that interview. I don't know. Or maybe he has to have a better way of conveying and communicating himself. But I don't think it leaves you with a warm, comfortable feeling that he sincerely cares about the privacy of your data. Last one. Any Ohio State fans in the room? All right,
I know that the impact that the events of the last 3 weeks have had on this institution, an institution that I love, and how challenging this has been for our community, our president, a man who I have great respect for, and for that I'm deeply sorry. I'm fully aware that I'm ultimately responsible for the situation that has harmed the university as a whole and our Department of Athletics and our football program. I want to apologize to Buckeye Nation. I followed my heart, not my head. I fell short in pursuing full information because at each juncture, I gave Zach Smith the benefit of the doubt. I take full responsibility. I take this responsibility very seriously, and I will do better. I've been a Buckeye my entire life. For the past 6 years, I've worked diligently to build a program that the great state of Ohio and Ohio State can be very proud of. And I appreciate the opportunity to learn from a mistake, and I will work as hard as I ever have to make our strong program even stronger. Thank you very much.
Okay, even the Buckeye fans, I mean, what do you think of that? Again, not very authentic, right? Kind of reading from the script. What's the biggest problem with that little press conference? What's the single biggest problem? Yes? Bragging. Kind of bragging. Yeah, what else? Body language is bad, no question. What else? Yeah? Pardon me? If you're fake, it's not genuine. That's absolutely, yes, ma'am. Yeah. I'll tell you the biggest problem I have with it, no acknowledgement of the victim. No acknowledgement of the victim, right? It's almost narcissistic the way he talks about him and his coach. And there was a woman that was, affected by this, right? The coach's wife. And he never says anything about her. And I think that's a huge miss on their part. By the way, it's not uncommon when we see organizations in crisis and individuals in crisis that it repeats itself, meaning, the company doesn't just have one problem, they've got two or three, a la Facebook, right? A la Urban Meyer, by the way, who just got fired this past year before the end of the season for problems that he had as he made his way into professional ranks. So let me just wrap up here and talk about how we bring closure. How we bring closure. So we often get hired at the tail end of crises where they want us to kind of come in and help repair the brand, kind of get the brand back into a better place. So the first thing that you have to do to get closure is you have to have full disclosure of what happened. So anybody here from Michigan State? But I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the Michigan State case, right? Does anybody really feel like they understand the intricacies of what happened at Michigan State? Similar to the Las Vegas shooting, does anybody really feel like they understand? No, they don't. And as a result of that, there is no closure. So you have to have a full accounting of what happened. You may not be expected to be able to do that in the moment, but at some point it's expected that you can tell me what happened. Secondly, obviously, tied with that is accepting the responsibility that you're supposed to accept for it. The second thing that I always tell people is it's really important to remember that there's always a look back on the crisis. What do I mean by that? As soon as people start kind of evaluating you to try to sort of say, are they going to give you the relief to let you restore your brand, they're going to see what you did in the moment. So you've heard this expression, what they know, when they know it, what they do, okay? So the sooner you have recognition of that there's going to be a look back, the quicker you're going to start acting the way you should act responsibly because you know you're going to be judged. There's a judgment day, I guess is another way of saying it. The third thing is, what are you doing to mitigate or prevent this from ever happening again? Okay, there's an expectation that you're going to tell me that you learned something from this and that you're going to take the steps to make sure that doesn't happen again. And the final thing is, what are you doing to make the world a better place? So the reason that we have tamper-proof packaging is because of Tylenol, for the folks in the room that remember that. The reason that we have double-hulled tankers is because of Exxon Valdez, all right? So again, the idea of giving something back so that others don't repeat your mistakes. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions. And there's no questions, that's fine too. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for coming to speak with us. Midshipman Walker, Maine Maritime Academy. This morning, one of our panelists said that even though we are more connected than ever, we seem to be farther apart than ever as well. I was curious if you had advice how we as leaders can avoid being divisive and instead, trying to reunite people, whether if that's in the military or in a conference room.
Yeah, it's interesting because I teach at the University of Texas, and one of the most important, it's a public relations strategy class that I teach, and one of the most important things that I try to impart on my students is the need to be very widely read and the need to be very open-minded to a lot of different ideas and sources. I think what's happened now is that we have really become very tribal as a nation. And as a result of that tribal mentality, we tend to tune in to the sources of information, whether we're on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, that best feed our narrative or our tribal narrative. And so, either tune it all out or at the very least, be much more, widely read. Somebody once said, seek first to understand and then be understood. I think that's excellent advice. But I think in general, I'm hopeful because I'm seeing some signs of this, that people are starting to recognize that civil discourse has really just, run off the rails. And that we've got to return to an ability to be able to have, disagreements without being disagreeable.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Midshipman Bichet, University of Pennsylvania. It would be unreasonable to try and prepare for every possible crisis that could take place. So how would you say how we could discern what to prepare for and how, so that we don't have to wait until the thunder to build the ark, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll just pop this up real quick because it's kind of a little checklist. But what we do, in the corporate world is we do what we call a vulnerability assessment. Okay, so go into the organization and say, look, I'm going to interview the top 25 leaders, in the organization. And the question that really brings it all out is, what keeps you up at night? What are you really worried about? And what happens is you make a list of these 25 or 30 things. And if I hear it once, that's one thing. But if I start to hear a pattern, suddenly I'm starting to think, okay, this is a vulnerability that the organization has. Now then, once we do that, we go back and say, let's kind of rank order them, because we can't prepare for everything. You're right. I mean, right now an airplane could fly into this room and kill us all. I doubt there's a plan for that, nor do I think we should have a plan, because the odds of it happening are so remote, right? But for example, if you're an organization today and you don't have a cybersecurity breach plan anticipated, you must be living on Mars, right? So that's what we do, and then what we do after we identify the critical issues, we create what we call a heat map. So I mentioned that software, that listening software. So you take your 10 or 12 critical issues, and what you want to be doing is listening for how other organizations are experiencing or encountering those, because you can learn from people that are going through it before you do. And we generally color code it green, yellow, red. So green is just something that's on my watch list. It's out there. I know that we're the kind of organization that could have this happen to us. Yellow, hey, I've got some evidence that suggests we're about to kind of get engulfed in this. And then red, of course, we're in it. And so one of the things that we also like to do is prepare playbooks. So in the crisis situation, because we live in the nanosecond news cycle, the earliest moments are some of the most critical moments. And so my ability to have anticipated the crisis, my ability to put maybe that first holding statement together, maybe that first Q&A document, maybe also some content that would defend our position. So for example, if my plant explodes, I may not be able to tell you in the moment everything that caused the explosion, right? But I can tell you what we were manufacturing in the plant. I can tell you how many people we employed. I can tell you our training mechanisms. There's a lot I can share with you. And again, if I want to be effective, I need to have that as creatively produced in advance as possible, so that when the crisis occurs, I'm ready to jump in and start communicating. And of course, what does that say to the people on the receiving end who are scrutinizing me? They at least have the belief that I want to be forthcoming and authentic and transparent. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Midshipman Second Class Karish, the University of Memphis. You said that we're moving towards more tribalism in the way we consume our news. Do you see that any way for the more traditional news media to recover credibility and move the news cycle back towards them, or do you see a further move towards that tribalism that you spoke about?
By the way, my degree is in journalism, and this has to be the most hurtful thing to me as a person to see our profession, the journalism profession, go as low as it's gone. And I wish I could tell you as I stand here today that I'm optimistic that we're going to see some awakening and that we're going to see a new journalistic model. But the reason I'm not is because we've gone to clicks for, the financial model has sort of shifted. So what moves the needle, what gets the eyeballs are these sensational clicks and clips, right? And so, honestly, I don't. I mean, I hate to say it, I really do. But I don't know. I don't know what's going to do it, short of some remarkable leader, who, and I'm not going to get political here, but some remarkable leader who really does, unify the country in a way that then the media would have less division to report on. But it's a sad state. Often people ask me, well, what do you, what sources do you use? I probably read 7 or 8 different sources, and then I still don't know, if I've got it kind of figured out. But I'll read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, I'll watch CNN, I'll watch Fox, I'll look at PBS. I tend to look at NPR and PBS because they at least have the ability to go deeper on topics. That doesn't mean they're not biased, but at least they give me a deeper, kind of understanding.
Thanks, sir.
Hi, my name is Grace, and I'm from Texas A&M University.
What university, I'm sorry?
Texas A&M.
Okay, good. Aggies.
Yeah. My question for you is, given that a lot of companies kind of have these crises that they're not expecting, what values and characteristics in the leaders of those companies, like CEOs and COOs, do you really see as valuable when they're going through these?
So this goes back to what I said before about being authentic and transparent, which to me are like cultural, core values. And so the CEOs that I've worked with that have been the best have been fundamentally committed to this notion of transparency, honesty, and truthfulness, right? And, by the way, and I'm sure there's some lawyers in the room, it used to be that when we were in these war rooms, we were generally arm wrestling with the legal team. And then the concern was always over liability. I will say that the law profession, the legal teams that we work with have come a long way from what I experienced 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And a lot of it's because they understand now that in this, again, this interconnected social world that we live in, the court of public opinion is really playing a huge role in sort of like prosecuting the case before you ever get to a jury, right? But I think CEOs who are authentic, they have a true North Star, and they stick to it. And if I'm sure you do know, but the number of CEOs that lose their jobs in crises is quite high. And in fact, the whole C-suite is quite high. So it takes courage. Really, that's what it really takes, courage and conviction. Yep.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Nick Yon from the Wharton School. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on brands or leaders that make decisions that satisfy their audiences, but at the expense of alienating others?
It's a great question. I think you have to start off with the definition of audiences, right? Which, another word for that is constituents. And so, and you can also say, well, what order do you put your constituents in? All right. So, for example, I've worked with CEOs. I remember working for a guy that some of you I'm looking at some of the folks that look a little older like me, but used to be a guy that I worked with named Al Chainsaw Dunlap. That was his nickname. And he would basically go into these companies, and his whole modus operandi was to find shareholder value. All these companies are mismanaged, and I'm going to go in, and he basically would just go in and just gut them, rip them to shreds. And sure enough, he'd find shareholder value. He'd rip the company culture apart. So I think we've gone as a country, and not the country, but the world really, has really shifted the order of priority of key constituents. And so this whole notion of a socially responsible company, a company that really puts its people first, I think has a lot more meaning today than it did, let's say, 5, 10 years ago, where shareholder value was sort of the mantra that everybody marched to. But it's tough. I mean, it's tough to balance all of your different constituents. So, for example, I've said for a long time that I don't think CEOs should be taking a step into the political quicksand. I've always said, don't do it. Just avoid it. Because, if you think about a country that roughly is 50-50, invariably, while you may make one customer happy, you're going to piss off another customer. It's inevitable, right? The problem is a lot of these organizations, that put their employees first, have employee expectations, who, by the way, they're having a hard time hiring. And if they don't make the right moves publicly, they run the risk of alienating their employees. So it's a tricky thing to balance. But it's a great question.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, sir. My name is Midshipman Hannah Prince. I'm from the Naval Academy. And I was wondering, a lot of your examples have really kind of clear places to place blame. And so I was wondering how you would recommend applying this model in situations where blame is not so clear, perhaps even like in a personal crisis where you couldn't really see it coming.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that always what we do? I mean, isn't that what everybody's trying to do when they're kind of like examining the situation? The first thing that everybody's looking for is blame. And you're right, sometimes, it's hard. I mean, I use the example, again, I'm not going to get political, but the police officer, where was she? The one that, thought she was pulling the stun gun and she pulled her regular gun and she shot the guy and killed him. And, that she made a bad mistake, right? And I had a chance to speak with a former police chief, a guy named Art Acevedo. He was at Houston. He was in Actually, he was in Miami, Austin, Houston, Miami. And I said, what's your opinion of that? And I thought, frankly, I thought, well, he'll probably defend the police officer. He'll probably say, well, it's an honest mistake. But he didn't. He said that woman went through, hundreds, if not thousands of hours of training. And to not know the difference between your real gun and your stun gun is just inexcusable. It's like, it's more than just a mistake. It's like a dereliction of your duty and your responsibilities. And it started kind of making sense to me, honestly. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard. People are always going to try to assign blame. I think there's also a tendency on the part of people to think that the quickest way to recover, to get out, is just to accept the blame. And, of course, that's not always the right path if you're getting sued, right? So.
Thank you, sir.
All right, well, listen, thank you so much again, and congratulations on all that you accomplished up until now. I look forward to reading great things about you as you go and conquer the world. I've heard some incredible stories about where you're going from here, and I think our country's in great hands. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. And on behalf of the United States Naval Academy Leadership Conference, here's a token of our appreciation for taking your time to spend with us.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah. Now, so I went through something called the JCOC, and what I was told is that if he gives me, if we were in a bar and he gave me this and I couldn't coin him back, I'd have to buy the beer. Is that still the rule? Okay.
Yes, sir, it does.
I'll owe him a beer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, take care, man. You told me there's a few books over here if they want them.
Okay, so we're going to enter a brief